Hello world, Krista here with Books and Jams, and here it is, the video that you have all been waiting for. My favorites and least favorites from 2017. 2017 overall was a fantastic reading year for me, and it was so difficult to decide which books to talk about. So I did do a 2017 kind of year in review, which I would love for you to watch because I'm able to highlight in that video so many more books than what I'm about to talk about here. Go ahead and click on that card and go watch that video and then come back over here to see which ended up on my final list of favorites and least favorites of 2017. Now, like many others, the books that I'm going to talk about today are not necessarily ones that were published in 2017. I often don't read new releases, and the new releases that I did read this year are mostly YA, and none of them made it onto my favorites of the year list. I'm going to start with my least favorites today. I did read 104 books in 2017, and I was able to come up with quite a long list of books that in some way disappointed me. Now, none of these are necessarily bad books, and actually I have quite a few unpopular opinions on this list. They're just ones that for some reason didn't sit well with me. I did narrow the list down to 5 of the books that I was most disappointed by in 2017, or when I look back at the books that I read, these ones kind of left maybe not a bad taste in my mouth, but I either really don't remember them at all, or I just look back at them and think, oh, I didn't really like that very much. So here are the 5 books that I was the most disappointed by, or my least favorite books of 2017. And they're in no particular order. The first one that I'm going to talk about is Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. Now, while I read this book, I was very distracted. It was in the summertime when I was at camp with the kids, and I buddy read this with April from Getting Hygge With It. And I think while I was reading it, I liked it more than April did. Or she liked it more than I did. I can't even remember now. But I do remember, as I look back on this book, that it was very brutal. There were scenes that were very difficult to read about. It was quite unbelievable. Parable of the Sower is set in a future dystopian America where people live in these compound neighborhoods. Each neighborhood is built with walls around it, and if you leave your neighborhood, it's very dangerous and brutal and animalistic and cannibalistic and just awful outside of the neighborhood. So it's about this 15, 16-year-old girl who lives in this one neighborhood, and her father is the spiritual leader of the neighborhood, and she starts to rebel and push against the way things are in their neighborhood. And eventually, their neighborhood is attacked and she has to escape. People that she loves are brutally murdered in front of her eyes. And she starts to run away, not really knowing where to go. Along the way, different groups or couples or people join her in this escape to somewhere. And she is kind of set up as the leader, which seems very unbelievable. She has some profound thoughts along the way. I read this again in the summertime, and I don't remember much about it except that looking back, it's not a book that I would ever plan on reading again, and I believe it's the first in a series or trilogy, and I am not planning to continue on reading more about this world. So that made it onto my list of least favorite reads of the year. Another book that I was not that thrilled with, so number 2 on this list, is Love Warrior by Glennon Doyle Melton, and this is a nonfiction book. I loved Glennon Doyle Melton's first book, Carry On Warrior. I found it to be profound and thought-provoking collection of essays or blog posts even. So I was very excited. I even pre-ordered her second book, Love Warrior. However, this one was much more of a memoir about her marriage and a time in her life when her marriage was failing, and what her and her husband did to work through that. It talked a lot about her mental health. All of these things are not bad. It just wasn't at all what I was expecting. And I was very disappointed because I really, really, really loved her first book and found so many nuggets of truth in there that I could apply to my own life. And this one just wasn't the case for me. I know a lot of people really do love Warrior, and I love hearing Glennon Doyle Melton speak still. While I don't agree theologically with a lot of the things that she has to say, I do appreciate her heart for love and loving other people, and I think that that's super important. So I'm not writing her off as I'll never read anything else that she writes, but I am saying that this one was not one of my favorite reads of 2017. The third one that I'm going to talk about today, I'm a little nervous because this one is very, very well loved on BookTube, and that is Every Heart a Doorway by Shauna Maguire. I expected a book that was about these children who travel to other worlds, sort of like Narnia or Alice in Wonderland, but neither of those are in this book. But children who travel to worlds outside of our own world and then come back and feel displaced and feel like they're not at home and almost want to go back to these worlds again. So this woman creates this home for these children to help them cope. That's what I thought this book was about, and to a degree it was. However, there was a whole murder mystery in there that I was just not expecting at all because I hadn't heard anyone talk about it. And in such a short book, I really did not feel connected to the characters, which I know other people say that they were able to. It just felt unreal to me. It didn't sit well with me, and I again have no desire to continue on with this series. Sorry if that's one that you love. Please still love me. I still love you. Another book that I really didn't enjoy this year was the first book of Calamity League. You guys have heard me talk about this before. This is by Paula Lichtarowitz. It was just a strange book. Actually, the top two on this list are very similar in that I often just didn't know what was going on. I had a hard time connecting with the story, connecting with the way it was written, and connecting with any of the characters, or just even figuring out what was going on. And I can't tell you about the first book of Calamity League because anything I would say would be a spoiler. But it was written very strangely. The story and the plot was often super confusing. It was well past halfway that I finally figured out what was going on. And that was just kind of annoying to me. I should have DNF'd it probably, but I didn't, and I finished, and it made it onto this list of my least favorites. And the last book that I'm going to talk about that I didn't love is Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. And here again is another very popular author. I know Fahrenheit 451 is used in schools to teach even 5th and 6th graders, which blows my mind because I had such a hard time connecting with this book. Again, the writing was so different. Maybe some could call it creative, but it was so confusing to me, and I had to reread passages over and over to figure out what is he trying to say. I didn't care for the storyline. I just didn't care for it at all. And so there you have it. My 5 least favorite books of 2017. I'm going to totally change gears now because there were so many more books that I really did love in 2017 that my list of favorites was super long, and which is why I ended up doing the survey, because I just had so many books I wanted to talk about. I have 10 here, but I am only going to talk about 5 of them because 5 of them I did a Friday 5 back in June or July, which I will link above and link in the description box below, of the top 5 of my favorite books from the first half of the year. So the 5 that I'm going to talk about today are from the second half of the year. So the first half of the year, I'll just tell you them here, and if you want to know more of my thoughts on them, pretty much watch anyone else's video who's read these books because they'll be on their list as well. But also you can go click on that other video to see more in-depth thoughts of why these ones were favorites for me. But I have on that list Lilac Girls by Martha Hall Kelly, Wonder by R.J. Palacio, Homegoing by Yad Gyasi, Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, and Burial Rites by Hannah Kent. All of these are ones that will stay on my shelves forever, and I will probably reread them at some point, and they hold a special place in my heart. But now I'm going to tell you about the 5 books that I loved that I read in the second half of the year. And again, these are in no particular order. I again am including a middle grade or children's book on this list, and that is The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane by Kate DiCamillo. This was just such a lovely story. It's about a bunny named Edward Tulane, a toy bunny, China doll bunny named Edward Tulane, who is greatly loved by this little girl at the beginning of the book. He is incredibly vain and proud and unappreciative of the love that he has from this little girl. As her family is moving, a tragedy happens and he goes overboard on a ship. And the rest of the book carries through his journey of being in different people's hands and the journey that he makes his way through life, and along the way is loved and is cared for or torn apart or beaten, or just the different experiences that he has that end up changing his heart. And it is sweet and beautiful and lovely. I read this to my campers at camp last summer, a little bit each night. It was the perfect length because we finished it on the last night and we all kind of cried and had a moment together. We didn't all cry, but we had a moment together that we were like, oh, it was such a sweet book, and I'm so glad that I read it. And I would highly recommend that you read it as well if you ever want to pick up a middle grade or children's book. Another book that I loved this year was A Man Called Eva by Frederick Bachman. I am so excited to read more Frederick Bachman. This was my first. I think I expected to enjoy it based on what other people were saying. At the same time, I was a little hesitant because it's like a grumpy old man, and I'm like, how am I going to relate to this story? But I really found Frederick Bachman's writing very approachable, very easily accessible for me. I connected right away to his writing style. I connected right away to Uva. I thought he was kind of endearing, even though at the beginning he was so grumpy. He was very set in his ways and wanted people to do things just the right way. And as an oldest daughter, first child syndrome, I could relate to that in a lot of ways. I'm a rule follower, and when people aren't rule followers, I have a hard time having mercy or grace for them. I just want the rules to be followed. I'm not quite to the degree that Uva was, but I could relate to that. I loved the other characters in the book, especially the neighbor named Parvana, who just moved into the neighborhood and gave Uva a run for his money. I just loved this story about this old man who had experienced a lot of grief and a lot of heartache in his life, especially recently, and wants his life to be over. He's just kind of done with it. But as he meets these people and opens his heart again, it just was a lovely story. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the most brilliantly written book I read this year, but it was by far one of my favorites. The third book I'm going to talk about that I loved at the end of the year was Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. This is a science fiction novel, and I'm honestly a little bit surprised that a sci-fi book is on my favorites list. But Dark Matter was such a fun read for me. It's about a man named Jason who gets kidnapped very nearly the beginning of the book. It's about his journey trying to get back to his family. When he wakes up the next day, he goes back to his home, and his wife and son are not really his wife and son. So somehow he's in another dimension, and it's just his journey trying to get back to his wife and his son that he knows and loves. So it deals with quantum physics, and it deals with the choices that we make and what would happen along the different paths of the choices that we make. It was super intriguing. It was very intense and kept me on the edge of my seat, kept me wanting to turn the page. The science was a little bit over my head. I did this one as a buddy read as well, and I kept asking Lindsay, is this really possible? Is this science real? Or is this something that Blake Crouch created for the sake of this story? I don't know enough about science to have known that, so parts of the science did kind of go over my head, but it was still intriguing and exciting enough for me to want to continue. And what I loved about this one is that I thought things were kind of wrapping up, but could still feel that there was a lot of book left, and was totally surprised and pleasantly surprised by another twist that happens later in the book that I didn't see it coming. I thought it was a wonderful book, and I'm so glad that I read that this year. The fourth book that I'm going to talk about as one of my favorites this year is one that I know many of you love, and it is The Final Empire, or Mistborn, which is the first in the Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. This was a pretty chunky fantasy book, which again, I don't read a lot of fantasy, so I'm surprised myself that a fantasy book made it onto my favorites list of the year. But here we have it, Mistborn. I loved it. I was in for the ride, and I actually read this book in just under a week, which is pretty impressive since it's a pretty chunky book. I loved the world. I loved the characters. I loved the magic system. I'm very excited to continue on with this series. I just thought this was so well done. And in the world of the Mistborn, there's the girl Vin, who is part of a gang of pickpockets and thieves, and she ends up becoming a part of a rebellion to overthrow the Lord Ruler, who is an evil ruler. And there are these elite houses that are a part of the aristocracy, and this rebellion wants to overthrow the houses and eventually overthrow the Lord Ruler. And that is the overall plot. That's what's going on in this book. There's a magic system in this world that is related to metals and going to be very confusing if I try to explain it. But this girl Vin finds out that she has this magic ability, and a good chunk of the book is her learning how to use the different aspects of this magic and how to use it to defeat the Lord Ruler. I wasn't sure if this one was going to live up to the hype for me, but it absolutely did. Yay, go Mistborn. The fifth book that I'm going to talk about as one of my favorites this year is Peace Like a River by Leif Enger. I'm also surprised that this made it onto my favorites. It's been said that it's kind of a slower paced book, and it doesn't have that intensity and action that a lot of these other ones on my list had. It is a much slower paced book, but I did find myself still very captivated by the story. I found that Leif Enger's writing was by far the best writing of any of the books that I read this year. The way that he put words together, and I've said this many times before, so you're probably sick of hearing it, but I just found myself rereading phrases and sentences and paragraphs because of the way that things were written. I just found it to be so beautiful. This is a story about a family whose oldest son is convicted of a crime and then escapes prison, and the rest of the family gets in an RV and tries to track him down and find him. The father is a man of deep faith and miracles tend to happen around him. The youngest, a daughter, is an author and a poet, I should say, and she writes this super creative Western, very rhymey but fun lyrical poem about this cowboy and villain in her world that she's creating. She's very spunky and lively. Reuben, the middle child, is the narrator, and when the story happens, he's 11 years old, but he's narrating from later in his life as an adult, reflecting back on this time. All of the characters in this book are just so alive. I think there's no other way I can say it. They had so much life to them and they brought something to the story. There was nothing that was superfluous. There was nothing that was extra. It all had a point and a meaning and was fun and important and lovely. I just loved it. Those are my favorite and least favorite books of 2017. I think if I sat down again, probably could pick 5 more favorites and 5 more least favorites, but I'm going to stick with these as my favorites and least favorites of the year. It was a fantastic reading year for me. I would love to chat with you in the comments if you agree or disagree with anything that I said. My love for you is very real. And it doesn't depend on if you agree with me. So I hope that you can give me the same courtesy even if I didn't like one of your favorite books. Be sure to chat with me down in the comments below. I would love to have discussions with you, and give this video a big thumbs up even if I didn't agree with you. I know I'm going to get thumbs down on this one. All right, that's it for me today. I will be talking to you very soon in another video. Bye.